Great. Good Wednesday, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining our panel discussion today. I'm Rand, and today we're going to talk about a very important topic called data centricity. With the era of digital transformation, probably any company now has the ability to collect and store tons of amounts of data from multiple different sources. It's very important to understand how you can actually drive revenue and drive value from this data. Today's discussion will be focused on understanding what data centricity actually means, how you can become one, and why actually you need to learn some tips and tricks to extract value from your data. Without further ado, let's welcome our panelists to the session. Today we have Ruben Sardarian joining us. Ruben is the
Hello,
founder
everybody.
and CEO of Infocratic. His consulting company is actually focused on nothing else than helping companies to excel at building data-centric mindset and cultures. Ruben has a lot of experience in data technology and leadership in different companies, and for the 10 years out of his 20 years experience, he was focused on leading data and analytics at Questrade. Ruben, how are you doing?
Great. Good to see
Where are you
everybody.
joining us today?
I am right now in the suburbs of Toronto, Canada.
Sounds great. How is the weather there?
It's cold, say around zero.
Okay. Our next panelist is John Garman. John is experienced information management professional specialized in semantic interoperability. He's principal founder of Chief Disambiguation Officer at Quantum Semantics. During his 30 years of experience, he produced an information management model called Q6, which is language neutral, technology agnostic, and domain independent, that lets you to integrate upstream vocabularies with digital assets in midstream associations and downstream presentation analytics. Is this
Wow.
correct introduction, John?
Nicely done. That's a mouthful.
Yes. I
How are you this
prepared for
morning?
this.
You rehearsed. Good man.
Yeah.
Yes. Are you joining from Canada as well?
Yes, I am. I'm out in Alberta, just in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. We got about 4 inches of snow this morning, and it's about minus 12. So it's
Wow.
Wow.
full-blown winter here this morning.
I'm in Los Angeles. We have somewhere around 21 on average here. So.
Yeah, there
Stop
you go.
teasing us.
Yeah,
Great. I'm
we should be
excited to
doing the
have you
show on
here on the
location.
panel.
Yeah,
Yeah. Next time we should do in person in Cali.
I agree. Let's do that.
Let's do that. Let's plan that for
Thanks
the
for the
next
invite.
meeting. Sure. So let's go on and start actually the meeting from nothing else than overall overview to understand what is data centricity and why actually organizations should care about this. So I want to actually start with Ruben. Ruben, can you tell about data centricity and tell us why companies should focus on this and what are the values that you can get from being a data centric? With just short overview.
Yeah. So my definition of data centricity is a data centric is a company essentially that has a single data model, and a company that prioritizes managing data and information over managing systems and technology. So you put data first. And why this matters is because, well, if you think about it, technology and systems, they all come and go. And even organizational structures, they change, people come and go. Information and data is what stays. So it's actually, I consider after people that to be the second most important asset in the companies. And what's happening today is that the landscape in businesses, the technology and data landscape is becoming vastly more complex than it was, say, 20 years ago, right? So it's an exponential curve, and there's a lot of kind of historically organizations, they evolved to be application centric or system centric, right? So we either buy an app or we build an app for everything that we want to do, every function, right? And then we're facing challenges of how to integrate all these apps, integrate all these systems, and each of them comes with its own model. Each of them comes with its own definitions, semantics, and things like that. So trying to make all of that work together is a very complex thing, and actually, without being data-centric, I don't see how a company can be efficient at this.
Understood. Great. Building on the definition that Ruben provided, John, can we kind of try to understand what would be the criteria to call a company data-centric and what would be the criteria to not to profile one as data-centric? So what would be kind of the threshold to say, hey, if you have this, then you can be considered a data-centric company?
That's a great question. I'm going to probably be channeling Dave McComb, who literally wrote the book on data-centric architecture. But I think his definition, well, he'd probably push back a little bit. I'm not sure that a company ever becomes fully data-centric. It's kind of it's a process and a program. I don't know if it's an arrival point, but having said that, to amplify Ruben's point, it does require a single model, and Dave describes it as a single, simple, shared data model across the enterprise. Getting there involves adopting a model, beginning at some point, and Dave sort of he espouses a small sort of incremental approach. So figure out where your big pain points are and start with your single model and start absorbing data from applications in a way that's measured and measurable and gives you immediate results.
That probably requires not only solving technical challenges to become a data-centric, but also transformation of company culture. Am I correct?
Oh, absolutely. There's a huge inside and outside companies. There's huge forces at work to, as Dave describes in his book, to kind of thwart the efforts to become data centric. As Ruben mentioned, one of the largest ones is the status quo of vendors. They're not going to easily give up their position or their revenue. The other one
Mhm.
internally, I think, is there's a lot of people inside a company dedicated to their particular niche, their particular data set, their particular applications, and it's a difficult challenge to get them to let go of that, because the perception, I think, in a lot of cases is that their livelihood is touched to their knowledge and expertise around SAP or any of the other large ERP vendors. So that's a big challenge. You're absolutely right. And that's why Dave recommends in his book to start small, to start with find an
Mhm.
executive sponsor who's interested in the idea, if not fully versed in in the implementation details, and then find a group or a small group of people that know how to adopt an enterprise data model and where and how to start building it out.
So in order to succeed, you basically should have the buy-in at the top level and the champions inside the team to actually drive the transformation,
Yeah,
right?
and even if you can get one, because Dave said like and I think Ruben touched on this as well. He calls it the integration debt, where huge amounts of money are spent every year by every company on the planet trying to, as Ruben said, keep all of those shoes in the air, all of those balls in the air kind of thing with integration. If you can get a little bit of that budget to start demonstrating that a data centric approach actually works and gives you immediate results, then you can start to acquire CEOs as you go along and build momentum.
I think the
So
estimate in Dave's book was that between 40 to 70% of modern IT budgets goes into integration and creating unnecessary copies of data, such as like
Yeah,
warehousing and all of the other data silos.
yeah,
So, given that it requires a lot of investment, Ruben, probably we should expect to have some best practices as well as some observed benefits from companies that already became data centric, which can help the CEOs and the top executives to have the buy-in, right? So, what are some benefits of data centricity that are actually measurable that can be these baby steps in the beginning to motivate companies to move towards data centricity?
Excellent question. I think uh, it's easy to measure the dollar spent. One of the easiest things to measure, probably. So if you can realize efficiencies from simplifying your landscape. So first thing that data centricity brings is simplification, and
yeah,
with that it brings cost reduction of
Mhm.
analytics, of like trying to do data science. So for instance, you can measure how long it takes data scientists to discover data, or how much a company spends on data engineering, how much it spends on data infrastructure. All of these are things that can be measured, and
Yeah.
you can measure before and after as you simplify your data landscape, as you kind of move the company towards data centricity. And I fully agree, it's a spectrum, and it's probably very hard to be uh, fully data centric. I only know a couple of companies that are fully data centric. Even the big ones, the big tech companies, they're the most data centric businesses we know. But it's very, very hard thing to accomplish, to be like to completely integrate the whole business into a single model.
Right.
But I know a couple of financial companies in the state of New York that are very, very close,
Mhm.
and essentially they're powered by very sophisticated metadata graphs. And
Mhm.
the culture of the company is that they put that metadata first, and they integrate with it.
According to statistics, an average enterprise is storing the data in 400 different sources.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
This this seems to be a terribly large number.
Yeah.
Nowadays, you can see trend from different startups and companies trying to actually produce software that can become so-called enterprise data aggregators that can help you to actually join to different sources of data and try to combine all of them together so that you can have one single interface to all the data stored in SAP, in local DBs, and etc. etc. So, is this trend of trying to kind of add additional layer of connecting different data sources together actually step towards data centricity or actually against that? What's your take on this, John?
Yeah. Well, that's a question. I don't think the answer to data centricity has got a lot to do with technology. It has more to do with mindset. So I think the companies that are professing, for example, to be data integrators, and interoperability is their kind of their buzzword that they like to throw around. It's kind of like trying to hardwire a whole bunch of different grocery stores or something. It's a very difficult challenge, and it's ongoing, and it's very expensive, of course, because the consultant's doing that kind of work. So they're expensive, and they're actually really hard to find. So a
Mhm,
technical solution that, again, it's almost like if you're feeding another application in to fix all the applications that are broken in terms of data interchange, you're kind of adding another layer of technology debt, to Ruben's point, that you have to support. I think
mhm,
one of the biggest benefits, and I come, and Ruben can attest to this, I come almost exclusively from the business perspective. So one of the biggest benefits of a data centricity or data centric approach is it kind of acts, the data model, the principles of data centricity actually kind of act like a North Star for data management.
mhm,
So everything you look at in term from the beginning, the very smallest parts with, data governance and business vocabularies, business glossaries, data dictionaries, all the way out to analytics, when you look through the data centric lens, all of those programs start to make a lot more sense. So data governance, as listeners and viewers will attest, is extremely difficult to get any buy-in on,
mhm,
because it's perceived to be a one-shot academic kind of like, oh yeah, these folks in the corner are doing, they're doing data quality, or they're doing data governance, and we'll just leave them to themselves, and eventually they'll pop up and ask for more money and that kind of thing. But in the it, through the lens of data centricity, when you use that principle of the single data model and you start small, you can start a data quality program simply by cleaning up acronyms and abbreviations and business vocabulary. So
mhm,
the approach that we're taking on that score is that, to your point about 500 or 400 different sources of information, say, right, or information and data. If a company has acronyms, abbreviations, vocabularies, codes, it doesn't matter which. In one of those, or multiple of those 400 collections, the data centric approach gives you a very clear path towards integrating all of those and building out
mhm,
your, what we call, the core. So a data centric core is simply business language, right?
mhm,
So Dave describes this in his book. It's like he's my hero kind of thing, but I keep quoting him. But the way he describes it is basically starting small and separating meaning from structure. So what that means is if you've got acronyms and abbreviations stored in XML, you've got it stored in SharePoint, you've got it stored in a database. By adopting the data-centric principles, now you have it stored in a graph, which is available, via internet protocols, etc. And people can actually find stuff that they're looking for. It's a very precise way to begin a data-centric journey. So if you have an acronym like DBA, for example, everybody has one. DBA can stand for 4 or 5 different things. If you have a core approach to data glossary or to data governance would be to say our first mission is to describe what that means, what it stands for, what it means, and how we use it. So, and then it allows people on a search to say, just type in DBA, you get database analyst, database architect, database, or you get doing business as, for example. And here's the other thing that I think a lot of companies worldwide are dealing with is multilingual interpretations of those. So in a properly designed data-centric core, you can connect the acronym DBA to its French equivalent, which is exactly backwards, ABD, I think. Anyway, I'm using that off the top of my head. It's probably not correct, so don't give me too much grief in the comments. But you get the idea, right? So, and that's just a little starting point that any company can start to do practically for free. It's very inexpensive. It's very practical. It gives you precision search. And then from there, using the same principles of the data centric with the data model and the principles of visibility and reusability, you can start to pull in things that are connected to the acronyms. Just a really quick example. One of the companies I worked for, financial services, they had acronyms that were connected to their franchisees. The acronym was CFA. It stood for Canadian Franchise Agreement. So when you think about the progression, it goes from telling me what that means, showing me in my CMS and my content management systems how many documents connect to that acronym, and then you can start to do analytics and you can include the documents. So as David said, data comes in so many different forms that when you separate the data from the semantics, you have all of these degrees of freedom now to start building out your data-centric architecture and your data-centric platform. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, excellent point actually. So building on this, I want to ask Ruben and see whether, in his experience when he's providing consulting to companies to build actually data centricity, whether these acronyms have also been something that he experienced to be focusing on during the baby steps, or the first steps that the companies you were consulting to were actually more on the cultural side, let's say, of the team.
I've seen this both at Questrade and in pretty much every single company I worked with. Is the language plays a crucial role in all sorts of data-related efforts. So data doesn't mean anything by itself. It doesn't inherently have meaning. It needs a context. It needs a context to mean something, right? And so all this metadata, the acronyms, the business language definitions, all sorts of metadata that ideally you store it in a knowledge graph, but it provides the context, and it keeps the context for your data to be useful. So without that, I don't really see how organizations can be successful with things like data management. Right? So it starts with the language. It starts with kind of defining the semantics and maintaining them historically through time.
When we are speaking about data centricity and about applying it in organization, are we talking about tech industry only, or finance industry, or data centricity is something that can be applied in any industry or market?
I think any industry will benefit from this. Like every business is a data business today. Every business is digital, and the businesses exponentially generate more data exponentially, and they also integrate more and more with the world around them. And it's just all about data. So the data centricity gives them a good tool to be super efficient in these conditions, right? So with all of it, you can think of data centricity as the best approach to manage complexity in this day and age.
Well said. Yeah.
But if we dive deeper into the company, then what about teams? What are the teams that actually are leading the data centricity? So are those more like data consumers or more data producer teams, so called? So let's say, are you talking most of the time to data infrastructure and architecture teams to actually lead the change, or mostly talking to the consumer side, like marketing teams or risk teams, to understand how you can actually drive the in-house motivation to become more data centric?
Um, I've seen it, like where I've seen this being successful. It's mostly is driven by like a data team, dedicated data team, or this comes from a business team. It rarely is successful uh, coming from IT.
Mhm, mhm,
I'm not sure, John, if that's your experience as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it has to come from the business side, I think. And very strongly, I've had some notable success with marketing because their whole thing is language, and they talk about messages, and they talk about like how do we reach our customers? What's the best way? Actually, the best way to reach any customer is to speak their language, right? So if you can figure out what their pain points are and express those in language that makes sense to customers, marketing is the happiest to throw some resources and some time, especially since marketing really likes to look good, right? Like they're kind of they're those guys that it's all about the image, and when you can get your image in front of executives and say, well, we just fixed a problem that we know everybody was having difficulty with, finding out what business terms mean, all that kind of thing. Marketing has been like one of my favorite teams to work with. There's also, depending on the size of the business, you might have content creators. So, for example,
mhm,
people that work with metadata a lot typically live in the content management sphere, which is kind of where I do most of my work. So, getting them to understand that if they have a centrally managed hub of metadata values, for example, that they can pick from, and they make that process easy, then it tends to follow out that because they're very practical folks on the content side, you can make the whole data centric concepts more concrete. So, and I just want to echo another point that Ruben made, that being data centric doesn't mean that all your data lives on prem.
Oh yeah.
It's because it's an attitude, right? You can sort of, once you start to get used to the principles of data centricity, you can sort of say, okay, so we have, for example, address information everywhere. And typically that's one of the biggest sources of data quality pain. Why don't we subscribe to a service that we can apply the simple single shared data model to and outsource all of our addressing data?
mhm,
Makes sense,
mhm,
right? So then when somebody's looking for a customer address, they can go to the core. They don't care, a user at an enterprise doesn't care where the data is stored. They can go to the core and say, I've got a customer named Phil Rogers, and they start typing in the address on the intake form, and the service provides the exact right address, zip code, postal code, whatever else you need, and it's data quality all the way down from there. So
mhm,
yeah, it's yeah, to go back to the point of your question, Hrant, was I think marketing is a good one, content management is a good one. The data guys sometimes get stuck in one of the sort of status quo, like relational. It takes kind of a nimble mind
Mhm,
who's worked with relational for too long to kind of understand that there's a different way to a different way to deliver information without necessarily using a relational structure.
mhm, mhm,
That's a mind bender for them, because they're saying, well, because I've got a slide up in one of the presentations I did just last week for DAMA South Africa that shows the semantic equivalence between a doctor's note and two different records in a patient in a clinical records. They're
mhm,
exactly the same semantically, but they're structured entirely differently. And then the kicker was I can also structure all three of those, the content and the two records, as a graph and without losing any meaning.
mhm,
So you,
mhm,
when you find people in your company, and they are out there, they're typically love to do skunkworks type of stuff, and show them that you can make semantically equivalent statements about business using any structure that you want. If the
mhm.
light bulb goes off, pick that guy or pick that girl, and run with them, because they'll get it.
So actually, whatever you mentioned completely relates to my own experience as well. I believe that you should have the business teams leading the change, and you should also have somehow the buy-in of the data teams.
Yeah.
Uh, for two reasons. Number one reason, of course, is the support that you get from the data team, but the second
Right.
reason is actually to clear the objections, because many times data teams, as you mentioned in the beginning, they can be used to certain architectures, they can be used to certain
Yeah.
model and using certain software. So there will be a lot of um, let's say conflict with the data teams
Yeah.
unless you have their buy-in in the
Right.
process of transformation.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I would say that in my experience, usually the leadership is coming from the business side, but then the support is coming from the data teams.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
couldn't agree more. Yeah.
I,
One of the first things I do when I get to a new consulting engagement is find the most technical guy in the group, or the most technical person in the group, and buy him coffee, buy her coffee, and just say, okay, so this is where I'm coming from. This is where you're coming from. We'll make a great team, right? Sorry, Ruben, I
Yes,
didn't mean
yeah.
to interrupt.
yeah. No, I was just gonna make an example of data teams that are failing, the ones that really don't have a say in the life cycle of data, so they're on the receiving end, and
Right.
typically they are just being told to just do analytics or address regulatory challenges. So like you can see that the data team is there like only to address like issues with data regulation or
Mhm.
privacy regulation, or to do analytics or data science, but they don't have any say in engineering practices, in enterprise architecture, in buy versus build decisions. So this
Right.
is another pattern that I see doesn't work.
Right.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, right. I think there are kind of different types of data teams, and based on the structure and the background of the way you actually establish the team, that would actually drive the fact whether they're involved in those decisions or not. Um, Speaking about data centricity applying in organizations nowadays, the question is why now? I mean, why are we talking about data centricity now and not, let's say, 10 years ago? If you check the Google searches, I actually checked it
Mhm.
myself
Oh yeah.
before this panel discussion to see what is happening to the Google searches of data centricity. And you wouldn't see a lot of searches for
Yeah.
around like 10, 15 years ago. Obviously, people were searching less in Google at that time, but also searching less for data centricity itself, while keywords like data driven or data informed have been there for quite some time. So, why now? Why are we talking about data
So,
centricity now, and why is this important topic nowadays?
Yeah.
so okay, I can go first.
Yep.
Yep.
So first of all, the definition of data centricity is only now starting to crystallize. I mean, like folks like Dave McComb, John O'Gorman, like there are lots of people who are pushing this agenda, but it's only now starting to surface as something that is very crystallized and defined. I would say like very few people have an idea of what data-centric means. Very few business leaders or even data leaders, they have an idea of what data centricity is. Even less are consciously trying to apply it. But there are also economic forces, right, that uh, push organizations to adopt this new thinking. Because and these are forces of competitions, because all of a sudden there is a competitor that becomes more data centric,
Mhm.
and all of a sudden they can do things that organizations that have a status quo, like they can't even imagine they're doing, right? And it actually starts with adoption of very advanced metadata management of using knowledge graphs. So it starts with knowledge graphs, things like that. I can make an example that if you remember, Google actually purchased a knowledge graph company 4 or 5 years ago, and this is when when they integrated it with search results. All of a sudden, you would start getting answers to your questions instead of just search results. If you
Mhm.
remember, up until it was I think around like 2017, 2018, around that time, right? When before that, you would search for something that it will just bring you pages,
Exactly.
URLs of pages. But
Right.
now, if you whatever you type, it tries to understand the meaning of what you're trying to say. Right?
Mhm.
So Google Knowledge Graphs is one of the most powerful knowledge graphs, and all of the big tech companies have them. LinkedIn is powered by a knowledge graph, Amazon, right? So when this type of approaches are being applied, let's say in financial services, capital markets, or they're being applied in manufacturing, media, all of a sudden these companies, they can move at light speed compared to their competition. They can afford to do things much cheaper in a much more efficient way. Um, yeah.
So would you say that those big wins that were observed by companies like you mentioned, Google and LinkedIn, and the fact that these big wins are pushing the competition is the main reason why data centricity is kind of observed and became more trendy nowadays than it was previously?
Yeah, I think it's just market forces. Like my very firm belief is that companies that don't become data centric, eventually they're not going to survive the competition because they're just not going to be able to economically compete with companies that are data centric. Just
What's
a
your take on
different
this,
level
John?
of, yeah.
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons that complement Ruben's comments. I think my own sense of why this is becoming really important now is because I think companies, especially large ones, trying to do integrations, and the stakeholders for large companies and governments are really getting tired of the silver bullet, the shiny objects, the expensive ERP programs, for example, that fail spectacularly. In Canada, Dave uses this in in his software wasteland example. We had a $21 million application to keep track of long guns like rifles and things across the country. It turned into a $1.2 billion project, and it's not working.
Mm,
So I think there's a certain fatigue out there with all of these huge sort of initiatives that come in and they're sold by um, by large integrators and tons of consultants and all of that kind of stuff. So I think the one reason for me that I'm seeing is that people are just seriously fatigued about that approach. I think the other one is to Ruben's point is the maturity of the approach and the maturity of the the steps you need to get there, and the introduction of the ubiquitous cloud sort of thing, and then you have sort of 4 or 5 exemplars that Ruben mentioned that are making huge profits from organizing their data this way, that it kind of makes sense to do it sort of in an incremental, very deliberate way, and get results that you can see right away. It's actually, and I never thought I'd say this, 5 years ago, but it's very, very complementary to the agile approach, where you have a simple model, the North Star with the simple data model. You have an objective of becoming data centric, and you need to deliver results every 4 weeks. You can't wait. You can't have these long drawn out uh, sessions that are costing you a ton of money and you're not getting any results, and then all the excuses, and then you just replace one integrator with another integrator and you're back on the merry-go-round and spending tons of money again. So it's an economic thing, it's a fatigue thing, and it's an awareness that other companies are already doing this, and that yeah, it's the what's that, the fear and greed sort of thing.
Fear of
I
missing
don't want
out.
to be,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't want to be taken over by a nimble little company that's kicking our butt on sales. And I don't really want to do the same things over and over again. Like Einstein said, the definition of insanity. So what's out there? And what's out there now is a very, very compact, very effective set of tools for getting yourself out of this um, buy-in and lock-in and all of those kinds of nasty things that cost you a ton of money. So it's kind of a cool, it's kind of a neat convergence of those three, I think. And like you say, market forces are right on top.
So market force and the economic value obviously are basically two of the three main factors that drive this trend of data centricity. Speaking
Right.
of economic value, can you tell how to generally companies can extract economic value from data? I mean, if you're speaking about data centricity, then all of this is done to actually make sure that you can drive the economic value from data, right, in the end. And you mentioned several examples on how can it help you to reduce costs, introduce efficiencies, get rid of integration. So what are kind of the general tendencies of getting economic value of data apart from this reduction of cost? So is there anything on the side of increase of the revenue?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I can, again, this is a favorite topic of mine. I can talk about it all day.
I'm going to sit back.
There's so many examples on the revenue generation side. Like a unique economic property of a data is that you can use it infinite amount of time, right? So it's not depleting, it's not non-rivalers, meaning you can use the data simultaneously in a ton of scenarios, right? So the value comes when you put it in a context, when it has a meaning, right? And then you start providing some more value to your customers, internal customers or external customers. So yeah, a good model to think about this is like the offense defense thing, so revenue generation or cost saving, and also external customers, internal customers,
Mhm.
right? So I did this exercise with a friend of mine recently where we tried to look at the list of all the industries and sectors, and we tried to find one where you wouldn't be able to generate some ideas of data products or even like directly monetizable data products or new added value products. And we spent probably a few hours brainstorming, and we couldn't because every industry, every sector, you have these internal and external customers, you have partners, vendors that you're working with, and you can always think of new ways how you can give them uh, more of something good using data, right? So I think we're very nascent in the data economy. Accenture predicts something like 31 trillion by 2035 or something like this, the value that they think is going to be generated by data products. Might be misquoting this, but they have some huge number. And actually, if you look at the economy today, 70% of it is already intangible. 70% of it is already digital goods.
Mhm, mhm.
So I think that's only going to grow.
Nonetheless, many times I can see companies not really basing their decision on data, not really trusting data. If I'm not mistaken, according to statistics, um, the surveyed 84% of surveyed executives said that even so, among those who
I would
actually
just my
have the
gut
data,
feeling. Yeah.
sometimes they wouldn't trust it. So,
They wouldn't trust
uh,
their own data. Right.
yeah,
Wow,
yeah.
that's a
So
huge number.
84%. I mean, and those are the companies that actually have the systems in place. I wouldn't try to classify them as data centric or non data centric because
Mm.
that was not the goal of the survey. But those are companies that actually somehow have analytics in place and somehow have some data model that is being used. So,
Wow.
what's your take on this, John? You seem very surprised. So, what
Yeah.
do you think? Any ideas of what can be the reason behind this mistrust?
Wow. Yeah, I think it actually speaks to the, to the, how should we say, the smokiness of the claims that integrators can actually integrate. And
Mhm,
so
mhm.
I think that statistics, that's a mind-boggling number. But I think that statistic actually speaks to lack of confidence that comes out of lack of visibility. So we used to have
Mm.
these conversations at a university college I worked at where we would present the president and the executive group with these statistics about registration, about cost, and inevitably somebody would say, "Well, my data is different. My data doesn't agree with you."
Mhm.
The reason that the way we won those battles, and we didn't win the first ones because it took us by surprise, but that lack of trust is not surprising. But the way we won that battle was to expose all of our data sources and all of the way we knit them together and all of the ways, and they got tired of that because it was so precise, it was so robust. So 84% is a number that says, well, in spite of the fact that I've got all of these integrators in my IT shop doing all of this work for all of this money, I can't see what they're doing and I don't trust the results because I can't fool around with them myself. So a big part of data centricity, I think, is visibility. It has to be data transactions and uh, data manipulation has to be explainable, if not visible. So when you go to an executive, if you want to make an impression on an executive in a data centric way, and again, this starts with, as far as I'm concerned, again, with the small stuff. You can see this in SharePoint. Like, millions of companies around the world have SharePoint. Do an acronym search in your SharePoint and see what comes up. Sure, you get lots of hits because it's a full text index, but you don't get any sense of precision. You don't go, oh yeah, CFA means Canadian Franchise Association, period. That's what it means. Bingo. You fire a shot and you hit the bullseye. So convincing executives and bringing that number down from 84% is demonstrating that you can do the little things really, really well. You say it's sort of like that line from Grizzly Adams. Okay, I skinned that grizzly bear. Go bring me another one.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think it's about winning their trust back and understanding that whole, the cynicism around data management right now is obviously pretty high. But getting rid of, I think the other factor there, gentlemen, is the fact that there's just so much of it. There's so much data that making confident predictions or confident conclusions from data in that, and actually that was the original point, Ruben, at the top of the show, making confident decisions in the midst of all of that complexity is not only difficult, but it's extremely risky. So an executive says, I'm 100% sure that Ruben's data is 100% accurate. We're going left. And he makes a mistake, and all of a sudden he's outside standing on the concrete with a cardboard box. He'll probably say, well, I don't know if Ruben's data is right or John's data is right. So I'm 84% or 16% confident that it's John. That's a hell of a way to run a business. So there's lots of greenfield for data centricity for sure.
Let me take the last question, and then I'll try to go on and see what are the questions from the audience, because I see them already popping up in the comment section. So my last question would be connecting data centricity with AI. I wouldn't pass any topic that somehow has the keyword data and not to introduce the keyword AI. So,
Yeah.
what do you think? What data centricity means for artificial intelligence industry or predictive analytics industry, and how it affects one another? What are the trends, for example, that we should expect to observe in AI industry from data centricity becoming more and more adopted by different companies?
So,
Ruben, let's start from you.
so let me ask you this question: if you think humanity will ever kind of get closer to a general AI, right? Something like the hell from Stanley Kubrick's Odyssey, right? Yeah. Do you think that will be powered by something like a knowledge graph, or that will be something powered by a relational database?
If we get there, then it is more likely that it will not be powered by a relational database.
Yeah. So far, all the kind of the in my experience, when we're talking about AI as let's say intelligence that's closer to general AI, or something that is able to understand semantics, understand meaning, interact with humans, then overall the concepts of data centricity are super helpful, because they make the landscape much more machine readable and available to algorithmic intelligence, to our machine learning models and things like that. Because you're very familiar with the field of ML and AI, and you know that probably 80% of the effort is getting the data, is preparing the data, right? So Andrew Yang has been talking about data-centric AI recently a lot, right? And focusing on the quality of data, quality of input, as opposed to sophistication of the models that we build. And in my view, the benefits that data-centric approach brings into the world of ML are huge. In just the quality of the data, in discoverability of the data, right? So you make your whole data landscape available to this intelligence in a much more machine readable way. Machines can understand the semantics behind that. It's
Yep.
much easier to integrate new data sets, new ontologies, new functionalities in like using knowledge graphs and data-centric approaches. Now, let's say if you purchase another company that uses some different approaches. Now, if you use the same semantic model at the top of those organizations, integrating them would be a breeze, right?
Yeah, that's a great point.
I also think that indirectly somehow the data centricity affects the AI adoption from the cultural perspective. If you're a data centric
Yep,
company,
good
if you
point.
absorb data centricity, then you are more likely to actually be keen towards putting more effort into also not only enjoying the results of data centricity, but also trying to enjoy the results and positive outcomes from AI perspective as well, which will
Yeah.
Yep.
contribute across the industry. What's your take on this, John? What do you think?
Oh wow. Okay, I'm glad Ruben went first because I had a chance to gather myself a little bit. Um, okay, so my thoughts are that the models that Dave and myself and Ruben are working with, the simple shared single model at the core of all of this, um, data centricity, is a faceted model. So by that, a
Mhm,
facet is just a simple dimension of information that are common to all enterprises. I use something called a Kipling key. It's Q6 is named after Rudyard Kipling's six honest serving men: who, what, when, where, why, and how. It turns out that in order to get a little bit more granular on that idea, there's 19 subfacets, I guess, that apply to every business on the planet. And actually, my contention, my proposition is that once you understand that, and once you start classifying and identifying and creating equivalences in your data, starting with vocabulary, that those 19 dimensions or 19 classes of information form potentially a very dense cube of enterprise information. And the cube is much more navigable than, for example, a broad knowledge graph
mhm,
space. It's think of it as a knowledge graph that's compressed and looks more like a computer chip than a tabletop. So you can
Mhm.
basically drill down, drill sideways into all of these different dimensions of information. To Ruben's point, when you make them common, when you make them universal, which I believe they are, I've been doing this, using this model for 19 years, and I haven't found dimension number 20 yet. When you dedicate yourself to that kind of discipline of classification and identification,
mhm,
there isn't anywhere you couldn't go, including to AI. So I think the the models are complementary, and I believe that once we start understanding that these dimensions of communication are common, that AI will become closer to a reality. So instead of all of the heavy algorithmic lifting, you can have that, but in addition, you can work from a model that's already dimensional, it's already compact, it's already navigable and understandable, and you can build all kinds of insights from the middle of that core.
mhm, mhm, mhm. Great. Thank you very much for touching on the topic. And generally, thank you very much for taking your time to give so detailed answers to the questions that we prepared. I would love to go on and try to allocate some time on the comments from the audience. So if
Sure,
you
Sure.
don't mind, let me read some questions and take it
certainly.
from there.
Yeah.
So we have Lilith Harsunyan asking us, would you like to hear would like to hear your thoughts on the biggest misconceptions and myths about data centricity? So Ruben, John, who wants to take the question?
I think when most um, people talk about data centricity, they just mean, okay, we want to do more with data, right? We just want to use data, or we want to use it in more ways. This is the context how I've seen most executives talk about it. When you ask companies if you are data centric, of course we are data centric. You know, we just invested in a new data lake, or we bought a new shiny
Yeah.
BI tool or something like that. Of course we
Right.
are data centric, right? But like I said, this concept is just crystallizing. So
Mhm,
in my worldview, data centric does not mean yeah, we're doing more or better with data. it means that we're putting data and information first. We're prioritizing it over
Right.
systems and technology, and we're trying to build this single data model, to unify
Mhm,
how different pools of data work in our organization to make
Yep.
the data model simpler.
mhm, mhm,
I think another one might be that a myth might be that you have to get rid of all your old applications and become fully data centric overnight. That
Hmm.
just doesn't happen. Possibly another one is that it's a product. Data centricity is a program.
mhm,
It's not even a
mhm,
project. It's an ongoing program. Um,
mhm,
so I think that would be another myth. I think that I guess going back to my, and I'm going to harp on this a little bit, but another myth might be that data centricity is expensive. It doesn't
mhm,
have to be. So I use the analogy of you're standing next to a 6-story building, and you've been told by your boss that you have to climb the building called digital transformation, and we'd like you to do it in 3 months.
mhm, mhm,
Okay, so the engineer that's standing there looking at this and going, well, yeah, sure, whatever. So he goes out and he borrows something from Archimedes, and he builds a ramp to each of the levels. So it's just basically an inclined plane that goes to the first floor, second floor, third floor. So that ramp is what we're proposing for starting with a core rather than trying to climb the whole building at once.
mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. So, to kind of try to summarize, data centricity is more about making the baby steps in the transformation in the beginning, instead of trying to take an end-to-end approach, which could be costly. So, making these baby steps actually helps you to have the buy-in, helps you to have the ability to observe the positive impact,
Yeah,
which then can actually help you to make data-driven decision about data centricity.
very
Yeah,
wow, that's well put, man. Well done.
yeah, yeah,
A
absolutely.
data-driven decision about data centricity. Woo! Awesome.
Great. Let's go to the next question by Karina Papikian. So, Karina is asking, how can a startup start adopting data-centric mindset, and where should we start, and what would be the first steps? I think this is very related to the baby steps discussion. So,
Yeah.
maybe short summary on how you would specifically suggest it for startups.
Yep. Get in touch with your business vocabulary. So people, places, things, product names, activities, process names, all of those vocabulary values, and contact Ruben and I for a way to organize those, and we'll help you out.
Yeah,
That's a great
That's our
answer.
pitch. Sorry. Yeah, that's be what I would recommend. Is always. I'm a language first kind of guy. I've written a number of papers on it, but that's where I would start.
Mhm,
yeah. So to build on top of what John said, yeah, absolutely prioritize language first. That's going to help you communicate as your organization grows, and keep tabs on complexity. Right.
Mhm.
So startups typically in their early days, they're in a very rapid build mode. They're trying to build out. They're trying to get customers, and typically in their later years, when uh, typically this happens when they get large funding rounds. So they go into big hiring spurts, or they go into big like buy or build spurts, right? When they introduce new systems into their landscape, and this is when the complexity starts to build up, right? So I think a lot of startups are actually fairly data centric in the beginning, in the sense that they have
Yeah,
this
good point.
single data model, and they're fairly slick in their data landscape design. But as they grow into this data spurt, growth spurts, they forget about keeping tabs on complexity. And
mhm.
fast forward a few years, they resemble a typical mid-sized organization that has a landscape of 150 different systems that don't
Yeah.
talk to each other much.
Right.
Yes, I can fully share the same point. In my experience, when startups start in the early stages, they go for the MVPs, they go for the quick and dirty solution, and at that point, they may connect and use any different integrations, not to reinvent the wheel, and try to actually push their product. Which means, absolutely, in the very early stages, they can already become the type of company that is not really starting with data centric mindset. And
Right.
that wouldn't be problem in the beginning because you are trying to push more on the speed, right? But when you grow
Yep.
over time, you're basically becoming just another typical medium-sized company with many sources, as Ruben mentioned. So,
Right.
yeah.
And internally, like you say, the founder loses track of who's been hired the last week.
Mhm,
And if you
mhm,
Yeah.
don't have access to a list, just a simple thing like show me a list on the graph of my current employees and what their roles are. I mean,
mhm,
a founder shouldn't have to wander around the office looking for that. I know the office is kind of an old concept now, but
Mhm.
just that's a really simple example of giving a CEO confidence about how many people are we got on payroll, what are they doing, and where are they located.
mhm, mhm,
So another advice to startup founders is like to keep that trust in the data. Try to keep
Mm,
the uniformity of the context, right? So the answers that you are expecting from your systems and your people, try to track if they change through time, right? So it should be like, imagine if you're playing a musical instrument, you're building this kind of rapport with the instrument, right? So when you're playing a note, you expect a certain sound from the instrument. Now, if you're playing
mhm.
the instrument and you're constantly getting different sounds, that means something is wrong, right? So
something's not quite right. Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
yes,
that's a great good metaphor.
so if you continue, if you ask the same questions and you start getting different answers, this is a red flag. This is a bell that says, okay, something's not right here.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yep.
Let's take our very last question of the session. We have Ani Hartunian asking how we can use data centricity within management framework. So maybe, John, you can share some insights about this.
I'd have to get a better idea of what a management framework is. Apologies, I'm not familiar with that phrase really. I think I know what it means, but I don't want to assume anything.
Mhm, mhm.
Do you have any,
Yeah. Yeah.
Grant, do
Same
you have
here.
any? Yeah, I'm not sure. Annie, can you add to that question a little bit?
So let's see whether we can get feedback from Ani on this. But uh, overall, I'm on the same page with you. So I think I have some understanding on the question. So probably I think it's about the company overall management and how to improve the management operations, but that's just an assumption.
Yeah,
Uh, all right. I think maybe next time, Anijan, you can reach out to Ruben and John
yeah,
and try
please
to
do.
get more insights
Yeah.
on this. They're available on LinkedIn, probably. Am I
Yep.
Yep.
correct?
Yes, sir.
Excellent.
Yes.
So,
Absolutely.
Yeah,
We can continue the conversation there.
absolutely.
excellent. Then thank you, the audience, for the question and following us, and thank you, the panelists, very much for the insightful answers and the feedback. Looking forward to our next meeting and discussion, maybe in Canada, as you mentioned.
Yes. or,
That sounds good.
or maybe in California.
Or maybe in California.
Maybe in California.
It's
You're
not
welcome to come here.
There you go. Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you very
Well,
much and enjoy your.
thank you so much to
Yeah,
everybody.
this has been
Thank you,
fun.
Rand, John.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks, Ren and
really
Ruben
blessed.
and Lilith
Thanks
and
to Hero House.
everybody.
And
Alana.
thanks
Yeah.
to your house for
Yeah,
organizing this. Mhm.
yeah,
Right.
absolutely. Thanks, guys.
Cheers. Ciao,
We'll see you
everybody.
later.
Bye. Bye.
You're welcome.